The interview was going fine until the door opened. Ethan Brooks had prepared for 3 weeks. He had researched the company, rehearsed answers, borrowed a shirt from his friend Marcus because his good one had a mark on the collar that wouldn't come out. He had arrived 12 minutes early and drunk water in the lobby and reminded himself 3 times that he could do this. He was in the middle of answering a question about project management when the room changed. Not dramatically, just changed. The 2 HR interviewers straightened. A third person who had been typing near the window closed her laptop and stood. The temperature in the room dropped approximately 4 emotional degrees. The woman who walked in was 34 years old and ran a company that 400 people depended on, and that had appeared on 3 consecutive best-performing lists, and that she had built from a consulting firm into a national operations powerhouse in 9 years. Her name was Rachel Kim. She was, by the specific consensus of everyone who worked for her, brilliant, precise, and not a person to disappoint. She looked at the 2 HR interviewers. They both found reasons to leave. She sat down across from Ethan. She looked at him for approximately 5 seconds, the quiet, thorough assessment of someone who has been doing evaluations for long enough that the process takes seconds, not minutes. Then she said, "Be my boyfriend." Ethan said, "I'm sorry?" She said, "I need a boyfriend. Specifically, I need someone who will occupy that role for my family's benefit for approximately 8 weeks. I'm prepared to compensate you generously," he said. "Is this part of the interview?" She said, "No, the interview is over. I have a different proposal." She slid a document across the table. He looked at the number at the bottom. He had never seen that many zeros attached to his name in any context. He said, "Why me?" She looked at him with the expression of someone who has a complete answer and is deciding how much of it to share. She said, "Because you're available, you're presentable, and I knew your face before you walked in the door." That last part didn't make sense to him then. It would make sense later. And when it did, it was going to change the entire shape of the story. Please like this video. Hit that button. Subscribe too. It's free and it always will be. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. Now let me take you back to where Ethan started. Ethan Brooks was 28 years old and had been for most of his adult life doing the math on a situation that didn't add up favorably. He had grown up with a single mother who worked 2 jobs and who had told him, with the specific conviction of someone who knows what effort costs and believes in it anyway, that if he worked hard enough, the math would eventually change. He had worked hard. He had put himself through 2 years of community college and then transferred to a 4-year university. He had never fully understood how the scholarship that covered the remaining 2 years had materialized. Exactly. The financial aid office had told him it was an anonymous donor fund. He had said thank you to the paperwork and moved on because he had 2 jobs and no time to investigate generosity. He had graduated with a degree in operations management and a debt level that was lower than most of his peers, and a resume that showed someone who had been working since he was 17. He had been looking for the right position for 8 months, not just any position. Something that matched what he was actually capable of, rather than what his current financial situation suggested he should accept. His friend Marcus told him this was idealism. Ethan told Marcus that holding out for the right fit was strategy, not idealism. Marcus told him strategy didn't pay rent. Ethan had applied for the position at Kim Operational Group because it matched every criterion: the role, the company's work, the growth trajectory. He had not expected to get the interview. He had gotten the interview. He had not expected the interview to go the way it went. Rachel Kim was 34 and had the specific biography of someone who had been told at multiple points that what she was building was too ambitious, and who had treated each instance of that feedback as data about the person delivering it rather than data about her ambition. She had founded Kim Operational Group at 25, following 3 years of watching a consulting firm she worked for do the right work with the wrong structure. She had known at 25 exactly what she wanted to build and approximately how long it would take. She was patient. She was exacting. She did not confuse being respected with being liked, and she did not confuse being liked with being effective. She was also, behind the reputation that preceded her into every room, a person who had been carrying a specific burden for 3 years. Her family, the Kim family, with its specific traditions and specific expectations and specific patriarch who had turned 72 and had decided that his eldest daughter's unmarried status was a problem requiring a solution, had been applying pressure. The solution they had identified was a man named David Park, the son of a family-aligned business partner, 38 years old, perfectly acceptable in every objective metric, and someone Rachel had dinner with twice, and had immediately understood she would spend the rest of her life managing rather than partnering with. She had 3 months until the family meeting where the arrangement was expected to be formalized. She needed a different plan. She had needed someone who would be credible, presentable, and critically, someone she had some prior knowledge of. Ethan Brooks had walked into her building on a Thursday morning, and she had recognized his name on the interview list, and she had made a decision. Ethan read the contract at the table while Rachel waited. She was not impatient. She was the kind of person who understood that if you were asking someone to make a significant decision, the least you could offer was the time to make it. The terms were specific: 8 weeks, attendance at 4 family events, believable conduct consistent with a 6-month relationship, discretion maintained throughout, a payment structure that included an immediate amount and a completion bonus. He looked up. He said, "Why me? And I mean the real answer," she said. "Your name was on an interview list I reviewed last week. I recognized it." He said, "From where?" she said. "I'll tell you that when we know each other better," he said. "That's not a reassuring answer." She said, "It's an honest one." He sat with the contract. He said, "What happens if your family doesn't buy it?" She said. "Then I've wasted 8 weeks and you keep the initial payment regardless," he said. "What happens if they do buy it?" she said. "Then the arrangement ends cleanly, you take the completion bonus, and I have time to manage the longer-term situation on my own terms," he said. "And the job, the position I interviewed for?" She said, "That was a real interview. If you're qualified, you'll be offered it through the normal process." "I'm not conflating the two things." He looked at the contract. He thought about the 8 months of strategic patience that Marcus called idealism. He thought about the number at the bottom of the page. He said, "I have one condition." She said, "What?" He said, "If we're going to be convincing, we need to actually talk to each other like people, not a contract. Real conversations." She looked at him. She said, "That seems achievable." He signed. The first family event was a Sunday dinner at the Kim family home, a house that communicated through its architecture and its furnishings, and the way people moved through it, several decades of accumulated success. Ethan had dressed carefully. He had rehearsed some things with Rachel in 2 preparatory conversations that had been professional and slightly strange, and had produced, by the end of the second one, something that felt almost like a rapport. Almost. Rachel's father, Charles Kim, was 72 and had the quality of someone who had built things and assessed things, and was now primarily interested in the question of what would outlast him. He shook Ethan's hand and looked at him in the specific way of a father determining whether a man was worth his daughter's time. He said, "What do you do?" Ethan said, "Operations management. I've been working with mid-market firms. I'm in transition at the moment." Charles said, "In transition." Ethan said, "Looking for the right fit rather than the next available position." Charles looked at his daughter. Rachel said nothing. Charles looked back at Ethan. He said, "That's either discipline or stubbornness." Ethan said, "My mother would say both. She'd mean it as a compliment." Charles made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but acknowledged the answer. It was. Rachel told Ethan in the car afterward the best response he could have given. The second event was harder. David Park was there. Not as competition. The family had not formally abandoned the arrangement, merely paused it pending observation of Rachel's claimed relationship. David Park attended as a family connection, naturally, innocently. He was, as Rachel had told Ethan, perfectly acceptable in every objective metric. He was also watching Ethan with the specific attention of someone who has a stake in an outcome and is gathering information. Ethan noticed. He said nothing about it at the event. In the car afterward, he said, "David Park was there." Rachel said, "I know." He said he was watching us. She said, "I know." He said, "Is the family actually pausing the arrangement, or are they running a parallel evaluation?" She looked at him. She said, "You're perceptive," he said. "Answer the question," she said. "Parallel evaluation," he said. "So we're not just being assessed as a relationship, we're being compared." She said, "Yes." He said, "That changes what we need to do," she said. "I know." He said, "Okay." She looked at him. She said, "Okay?" He said, "We'll be better. Let's figure out how." Please like this video. Those likes make this kind of story possible. Hit the button. Subscribe if you haven't. Drop a comment right now. Where are you watching from? Now the moment that changes everything. They had been working together for 3 weeks. The events, the preparatory conversations, the increasingly natural rhythm of 2 people who had started as a transaction and had found somewhere in the middle of it that the other person was interesting. Not romantically, not yet, but the conversation had stopped being work somewhere around the second week. Ethan had asked one evening over coffee after the third event, "What do you actually want? Not from the arrangement, from your life." She had looked at him. She said, "Nobody asks me that." He said, "I just did." She had talked for 40 minutes. Not about the company, about the things behind the company. The version of the future she was building toward that had nothing to do with the family arrangement and everything to do with what she believed she was capable of building with the right person beside her. He had listened. He had said, at the end, "That sounds like a life worth building." She had looked at him with an expression he didn't fully know how to interpret. She said, "You're not what I expected." He said, "What did you expect?" She said, "Someone who needed the money." He said, "I do need the money." She said, "That's not all you are." He said, "No." They had been quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There's something I need to tell you. I've been deciding when to tell you since the day you walked in." He said, "Okay." She said, "6 years ago, you were at the university on the west side. You were working 2 jobs, one in a copy shop, one in a warehouse. You parked your car in a lot 2 blocks from campus, and you slept in it some nights because your apartment lease ran out between semesters and you couldn't afford the gap." He looked at her. She said, "I drove past that lot one evening. I saw you through the window. You had a textbook open on the steering wheel and you were using your phone flashlight to read." He said nothing. She said, "I made some inquiries. I found out what school you were at and what you needed to finish. I donated to the anonymous scholarship fund in the amount your final 2 years required." Ethan sat very still. She said, "You didn't know me. I didn't know you. I saw a person doing something incredibly hard, and I was in a position to make it slightly less hard." He said, "That was you," she said. "Yes." He said, "For 6 years, I've been grateful to a scholarship fund." She said, "I know." He said, "Why didn't you ever say anything?" She said, "Because it wasn't a transaction. I didn't want anything from it. I just wanted you to be able to finish." He looked at her across the coffee table. He said, "I don't know what to do with this." She said, "You don't have to do anything with it. I just thought you deserved to know." He sat with it. She sat with him sitting with it. And then he said very quietly, "Thank you." She said, "Don't thank me." He said, "I'm thanking you anyway." The family meeting was scheduled for the 6th week. It was a formal dinner, Charles Kim's 70th second birthday extended celebration, which was also, everyone in the family understood, the occasion at which the question of Rachel's future was expected to be addressed. David Park was there with his own family. The dinner was elegant and well managed in the way of events organized by people who understood events. At the appropriate point in the evening, Charles raised the subject. He said, with the careful indirection of a man who had been doing this for decades, "It's good to see everyone gathered, particularly the people who represent the future of this family." He looked at between Rachel and David Park. He said, "I think it's time for some things to be settled." David Park's father made a comment in support of this position. The table's attention gathered. Rachel sat with a composure that Ethan recognized by now as the specific composure of someone managing something difficult from the inside. He looked at her. She looked at him. He stood up. He said, "Mr. Kim, I have a lot of respect for you and for this family. I've spent the past few weeks getting to know everyone here, and I've found this to be a genuinely remarkable group of people." The table was quiet. He said, "I also want to be honest with you, because I think that's what this family deserves." Charles said, "Go ahead." Ethan said, "Rachel and I didn't start as what you might expect. We started as an arrangement. She needed someone to occupy a specific role. I agreed to do it." The room was very still. He said, "What I didn't expect was to spend 6 weeks getting to know someone who is the most capable, honest, and when she lets herself be, warmest person I've ever met." He looked at Rachel. He said, "The arrangement is over. What I feel now isn't an arrangement." He looked at Charles. He said, "I'm not asking for anything from your family. I'm not in a position where I need your approval to know what this is. But I wanted you to hear it directly from me, because I think directness is the right way to do this." He sat down. The table remained quiet for a moment. Charles Kim looked at his daughter. He said, "Did you know he was going to say that?" Rachel said, "No." Charles looked at Ethan. He said, "You just told a room full of people that you came here under false pretenses." Ethan said, "Yes." Charles said, "Why?" Ethan said, "Because the truth was going to be more convincing than the arrangement ever could be." Charles looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at David Park's father. He said, "I think we'll revisit the conversation about settlements at another time." David Park's father began to object. Charles said once and finitely, "Another time." He looked back at Ethan. He said, "You'd better have more than honesty going for you." Ethan said, "I'm working on it." Charles made the sound that was not quite a laugh. This time it was slightly closer. The arrangement ended that evening. What replaced it developed over the following months with the specific pace of things that are building on a real foundation, not rushed because it didn't need to be rushed, not delayed because there was no reason to delay. They were honest with each other in the direct way that people are honest when they have started at the level of a contract and worked backward to something genuine. She told him things she hadn't told many people about the company, about the loneliness that sits at the center of leadership when you've protected it too carefully for too long. He told her things he hadn't told many people, about the years before the scholarship, about what it felt like to be doing the right thing in circumstances that didn't reflect it. She said, "Once, I drove past that lot for a year before I stopped." He said, "Why did you finally stop?" She said, because you looked up from the textbook and I could see your face. And I thought, that person is going to be something. They just need one thing to go right. He said, one thing went right. She said, yes, he said. And now look. She looked at him. She said, and now look. 2 years after the interview that didn't end with a job offer, Ethan Brooks joined Kim Operational Group in a strategic development role that had been created because Rachel had identified a specific capability gap that he was exactly suited to fill. He had gone through the normal process. 2 interviews, a panel, a reference check that he found slightly alarming because he hadn't been certain his references were strong enough, but which turned out to be fine. He had been offered the role. He had accepted. He was good at it. The company was better with him in it, not because of any single contribution, but because of the accumulated weight of someone who asked the right questions and meant the answers he gave and did not perform his value rather than demonstrating it. 3 years after the interview, Rachel and Ethan were engaged. Her father attended the dinner where Ethan asked her. He had been invited because Rachel wanted him there, and Ethan had agreed that seemed right. Charles Kim watched Ethan ask his daughter, and watched his daughter say yes and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, I still think directness is underrated. Ethan said, I got that from you. Charles said, no, you didn't. He smiled. Everyone laughed. The company they built together, not by combining their roles or titles, but by building in parallel, each doing the work they were best at, alongside each other, was recognized 5 years later in a national business publication as one of the most efficient mid-market operational firms in the country. The profile mentioned Rachel's leadership and the company's culture of direct communication and results-focused development. It quoted Ethan once, near the end. The journalist had asked what had made the partnership work. He had said, we started with a contract. We ended up with the truth. The truth turned out to be more durable. The journalist had asked what the contract was about. He had said, that's a different story. He had smiled. The journalist had noted that the CEO had also smiled at that point, which was described as notable, given her reputation for composure. Please like this video. Those likes are what lets stories like this reach people who need them. Hit the button. Share this. Subscribe if you haven't. It's free. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want the real one. And tell me where you're watching from. See you in the next one.